They call me the Black Knight.
Why?
Are you being serious?
Sorry, I'm colorblind.
Snarf Quest Tales is a mediocre and completely unfinished point-and-click adventure game from 2017. Looking at it, this thing is the picture of forgettable. It never once lands a joke, its voice actors don't seem thrilled to be here, and the puzzles are far more annoying than they are engaging. The project in the end was little more than the waste of over $37,000 in crowdfunding money. And yet, this forgettable waste of hard drive space is the scion of a tabletop legacy that dates all the way back to the 80s. This weird little guy here, he's the inheritor of a dead art movement that defined tabletop gaming for over a decade. This iceberg goes so much farther back than it would seem. For me, this journey with Snarf started about a month back during a bit of a non-controversy going on in the D&D world about an old product from the 1980s. In 1983, the D&D basic set was released in a red box. The cover was painted by an up-and-coming TSR artist named Larry Elmore. It's arguably the most famous and iconic D&D cover ever made. The story of its creation goes that Elmore had received one too many vague requests for revisions and had to force his way past all the secretaries to go speak with the big man Gary Gygax in person to find out exactly what he wanted. Gygax couldn't describe it, and instead he struck a pose. This pose became the dragon on the cover. But our non-controversy today stars the other figure in this famous image. Wizards of the Coast has taken a big press beating in recent years. The OGL crisis, self-destructing their relationship with Larian, and their will they won't they dance with AI. It's been a mess, and it's not been good for them. The marketing guys decided that it was time to try a little bit of outrage marketing. You know, piss off a small number of people to get everybody else defending them. It's a pretty easy trick. To pull it off, they announced a new official figurine based off of the Red Box Fighter, whose surprise, when you turn them around, was a woman the whole time. Now, the reason we know that this is outrage marketing, rather than just correcting for there not being very many female D&D characters of the past, is just the fact that there were so many iconic female D&D characters from that era, especially Alina the Cleric and the gals from Dragonlance. Now there's a small and vocal minority who go just absolutely frothing at the mouth whenever anything like this happens, and then they make it everyone else's problem. And while some did, this plan didn't quite go the way that Wizards expected. The vast majority of people on both sides of the culture war took one look at this marketing scheme and said, "Oh, yeah, that's bait," and then they moved on. I gotta say, I'm so proud of everyone. Good job, everybody. Still, a few people did point out that it was entirely possible that the Red Box Fighter might be one of Larry Elmore's other female characters. Specifically, there was a case to be made that the Red Box Fighter could plausibly be Tellery Windyarm from Larry Elmore's D&D comic, Snarf Quest, and one can certainly see some basic resemblances. Larry Elmore himself came out to resolve the ambiguity. Gygax had personally asked for a male fighter. Plus, Elmore pointed out, he had a particular way of drawing the gals. If it had been a lady, it would not have been terribly ambiguous. And yeah, I mean, he's not wrong. Anyway, like I said, non-controversy, nobody really cares about this, everyone moved on. Everyone except for me. I'm still here because my life has been locked into this the last month. Because when people mentioned Snarf Quest, I googled it because I actually hadn't heard of it. And very quickly after I googled it, I realized there's a video game, which means that I have to cover it. Larry Elmore's 1980s D&D comic for 12-year-old boys, that thing just became my problem. Now, we've talked a lot of classic D&D at this point on this channel. And we're going to talk a lot more in this video, especially focusing in on the fantasy artwork of the 1980s and 90s. Whether or not the golden age of tabletop RPG artwork has passed is sort of a matter of opinion, but the golden age of tabletop battle map art, oh baby, that's just beginning. And at the forefront of it is today's sponsor, Chepeku. Chepeku is a fantasy battle map maker that produces a massive variety of maps that you can use in your role-playing games. They're printable, they're compatible with virtual tables, and some Some are even animated, and all of them have variations to make them work at your table. But if you're a regular here, you've probably already heard this before, haven't you? But what you may not have heard is that Chepeku's got some other services too. For starters, they've got a sci-fi wing if your RPG of choice is more space-oriented. Which, come on, hey, come here. As a longtime 40k role-playing player, this service, it's for you and me. But okay, suppose you've got all the battle maps you need. Your players keep using Roll20 to draw mustaches on Strahd in the splash screen, and they're starting to lose focus. What you really need is to set the mood. Chepeku Scenes is a collection of background art that sets the mood for your games. Pirate lord lairs, war rooms, even bakeries. Chepeku Scenes is the perfect mood setter for narrative. Every single one of these scenes, every single one of these maps are available via Patreon. Sign up today with one of the links below and gain access to these incredible libraries of tabletop assets. And keep up to date on the deluge of new assets to keep you on the cutting edge. Thanks once again to Chepeku. Now, let's get back to the video. Snarf Quest is a property that is tied directly to Larry Elmore, one of D&D's great artists of ages past. His name is virtually synonymous with the D&D fantasy art movement of the time. Fantasy, although now quite distinct on its own, was back in the day a variety of pulp fiction. And this early fantasy had pretty much identical artwork associated with it. A painterly style, damsels in distress, a little call to adventure, classic pulp artwork. It was exemplified in large part by the work of J. Allen St. John, whose work was pivotal in influencing a generation of artists that would come after. Things began to change for fantasy after Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. It was fantasy so elegant and down-to-earth that it was kind of difficult to even associate it with pulp at all. His genre-shaking contributions are well known to the literary side of fantasy, but less known is his contribution to fantasy artwork. Tolkien was an amateur painter and artist. Although hardly prominent in those fields, his work is nonetheless remarkably influential in the field of fantasy artwork. It may be best said that Tolkien's influence was in sparking a style of fantasy artwork that wasn't pulp. The way he was able to bring this otherworldly vision to life inspired a generation. In the modern day, I think it's pretty fair to say that the Tolkien-esque non-pulp school won out over its counterpart. But this was not a sure thing. In fact, it wasn't really until the digital age that this more highbrow style subsumed fantasy art as the norm. For decades, this pulp art was still in style. And in fact, it was about to come into vogue. This image of Conan in 1966, a man with the face of a lion and a body that hadn't seen an easy day in its entire life, this image would near single-handedly catapult the artist, Frank Frazetta, to legendary status, and announce once and for all that pulp fantasy had formally declared its independence as an art movement, distinct from its predecessors. The old pulp influences hadn't been lost, but they had evolved, and it had taken on some influence from comic books as well. The result was distinctly its own visual medium, and it was far more evocative at showing the beasts of fantasy tales, as well as the enviable physiques of adventurers. Dungeons & Dragons would begin its history in 1974. But the game would take a few years to be profitable enough to have very much of an art budget. And when it did, it took very little time for the influence of legends like Frank Frazetta and Boris Vallejo to begin affecting the style of Dungeons & Dragons. This style for D&D came roaring into the hobby in the early 1980s, when TSR managed to hire a true dream team of unknown artists to illustrate their game. Clyde Caldwell, Keith Parkinson, Jeff Easley, Larry Elmore, and by the end of the decade they'd also added Daniel R. Horn and Gerald Brom, as well as many others. The talent TSR had in their art department in the 80s truly boggles the mind, especially when you consider that this is where most of those guys got their start. TSR was just pulling these guys off the street and turning them into legends. Mostly, this dream team had moved on by the mid-90s, and the art style would begin to shift. roughly coinciding with D&D's 3rd edition. Now, look, I think I've proved last year that I'm hardly a coward when it comes to analyzing tabletop media. If a work of media like Dark Sun or Werewolf the Apocalypse has an environmental message, a political message, I'm not just gonna pretend it's not there to avoid partisans screaming at me in the comments. So with that said, the old D&D art movement of the 80s and early 90s, it too has a message that can't really be ignored. There is a point to this art, a deeper meaning that this stuff is meant to evoke, and we can't really have an honest discussion about early D&D art without mentioning it. The point is boobs. And thighs, actually. More thighs than you'd expect. But it's safe to say, this was D&D's horny era. This was mainly exemplified by the art of Clyde Caldwell and Larry Elmore. The other artists did participate, but those two really were the vanguard of the pin-up D&D art movement. D&D has mostly kept it in its pants a lot more in the last few decades as the art style changed. And there are several reasons for that. Both Elmore and Caldwell toned it down more and more as the years went by. And Caldwell hints in an interview that they were probably under some pressure to do so. Given that they were being relentlessly attacked by Christianity during the Satanic Panic, it's pretty likely that TSR was trying to avoid the optics of intentionally selling books that looked like this, to children, while they were currently under attack for trying to indoctrinate children with their sinful fantasy game. Elmore left TSR in 1987, and Caldwell left in 92, and the majority of the boobs and the butts went with them. They would, in time, come to be replaced by a new generation of digital artists, who were not painters first and foremost like the old guard. The style naturally began to shift with the change away from physical canvases. And this new generation of talent, not to say that they didn't make any horny artwork, but it was clearly much less their focus than it was for the two thigh guys of AD&D. The changing of the art team was the biggest cause, but there were a few others. When D&D first started in 1974, it wasn't immediately obvious who the primary demographic should be. It was decided that young teenage boys would be the target, and one could see why art like this might do well with that crowd. As time went on, however, I think that history kind of proves that TSR guessed a little bit wrong. Right here and now, D&D's demographic sweet spot to enter the hobby seems to actually be older teens and college-aged adults. That said, it may be true that this was still the right call. Gen X taking their childhood hobbies into adulthood was probably a necessary stepping stone to make D&D palatable to adults as it is now. With the popularity of the Forgotten Realms surging, in a world now dominated by Drizzt novels and Baldur's Gate video games, D&D would come to experience a tone shift. Gone were the days of many different D&D settings, with different themes and moods to suit your table. Now there was mainly just the one setting, so they better make it work for every table. There was a great deal of effort spent towards taking out the weird in favor of making D&D a generic game that every group could project their own ideas onto. This was reflected in the artwork. Gone are the dreamy and evocative what-ifs of the old art, replaced with straightforward art that was meant to serve as an example. Not to say that all the old art was great, a lot of it really was not. But it did have the objective of really sparking the imagination in ways that most of the art that followed did not. Plus, outside of D&D, the pulp fantasy art movement was starting to lose its luster, ceding territory to both the more grounded artwork of Tolkien-esque descent and the shiny new influence of Japanese animation that was beginning to grip a new generation of artists. Remember that most of the sexualization in these paintings descends from pulp fantasy artwork, and when pulp fantasy was no longer D&D's art style, the horny kinda left with it. Not to say that modern D&D art shares no common DNA with old D&D. A lot of the modern stuff looks very much like it descends from Jeff Easley's style. Overall, there were a number of reasons that the art changed. It all coincides with the state and history of D&D at the time, as well as shifting art movements outside of D&D. Pretty much all of it was the perfect storm that made D&D less and less lurid with time. I bet many people were expecting that the horny all got purged in kind of that BuzzFeed era where most of the more blatant sexualization started to disappear in corporate media. But in D&D's case, it was mostly gone already by the late 90s. But now I'm going to prove my bravery once more. I'm taking a stand. I'm going to defend the horny. Like I said a second ago, the big era where media stopped sexualizing its characters in the way they used to was, soft estimates, around 2014 to maybe 2019, and while corporations are still largely spooked off of sexualization from the culture wars of yesteryear, the culture itself has actually kind of chilled out considerably on the topic. Yes, the era of chainmail bikinis most certainly needed a rethink. But to be honest, I think there was a bit of an overcorrection. Nowadays there tends to be a couple loose yardsticks that get used to decide if sexualization of characters is too much or in bad taste. And where the goalposts are right now, I actually think that the old artwork passes by most reasonable metrics. Let's be clear, I've been vague, but when I say over-sexualization of characters, I mean the over-sexualization of the gals. One of, if not the largest complaints in this is that, it's great that women can be sexy, but not every female character should have to be. There should be many different styles of role models for women in the hobby to identify with. It's great to have some Bayonetta, but they can't all be Bayonetta. And here's the thing, even Clyde Caldwell and Larry Elmore were more than capable of turning it off when needed. There are so many examples of more modest women of varying roles in that era. I've even seen Larry Elmore's own drawing of Alina the Cleric used specifically as an example of positive drawings of armored ladies. And we haven't even talked about all the Dragonlance characters. There was a lot of variety actually to counterbalance the horny. Secondly, a common complaint is that the anatomy should be accurate if you're going to sexualize the characters. Once again, pulp fantasy tends to get brought up specifically when it comes to examples of sexualization that is free of that completely unhinged anime anatomy. Sure, it's idealized, but these are clearly actual human bodies. Plus, let's just take a second here, okay? 1 second. The way that pulp fantasy artists drew pelvises, hips, and thighs is a goddamn lost art. Okay, look at this. In 500 years, people are going to have to try and rediscover Caldwell's hip dip techniques like it's fucking Roman concrete. Sure, yes, you could tell Clyde Caldwell to give his ladies some pants. You could do that. But if you do that, you also need to go back in time and tell Michelangelo to put a shirt on his dudes. Some people just have a gift. Michelangelo had the ability to create abs that look like this. And so in my opinion, he has a moral obligation to create those abs. If Caldwell and Elmore can create pelvises like this, well, let me tell you, they've got an obligation to do so. A moral duty. The last thing that gets brought up is, a little quid pro quo. Hey, if you're gonna sexualize female bodies, there's gotta be some equal opportunity here. It's only fair for there to be some sexualized male bodies for the other side to marvel over. And, no, just because a male is shirtless doesn't mean they're sexualized. Just look at the way Conan and Red Sonja get posed when they're next to each other. One is sexualized, the other is a power fantasy. You know which one is which, we don't need to overanalyze this, one of them is posed like a bikini model. Now, let's bring it back to D&D. This guy here by Gerald Brom, this guy is shirtless to make you wish you had abs like this. This is a power fantasy. You're supposed to want to be this guy. It's not sexualized. When it comes to sexualized characters, you'll know it when you see it. Case in point, if you did want to see a sexualized shirtless male character, you'd have to look for work like, say this one by Gerald Brom, or this one by Gerald Brom, or this one by Gerald Brom. Bit of a pattern here with Gerald Brom, eh? This was all work he did for D&D's Dark Sun setting. So when he drew gals that looked like this, there wasn't as much of a double standard as you may think going on. So you know what? Go with God, Grognards. I am absolving you of your horny. Your artwork rules. Now, while this tradition of sexualized artwork kind of died out in D&D, it didn't die out completely in tabletop artwork. Notably, it stayed alive in Pathfinder after it was created in protest of D&D's 4th edition. Sure, the pulp aspect may be gone, but Paizo brought back the old horny. even updating things to live up a little more closely to those standards that I just laid out. Specifically, I find two of their iconic heroes worth mentioning: Amiri the Barbarian and Valoros the Fighter. These two are amazing. Both of them. They hit the sweet spot of that mix of like, I want to be that character, and I want to be with that character. Oh, you don't think they're sexualizing Valoros? Then why is he pouting like that? Why do they draw him like this sometimes? Why do they draw him like this other times? Plus, remember that whole like Red Sonja next to Conan thing? Now look at how Amiri gets posed next to Valoros. Pathfinder's artwork is honestly some of the most inspired of the entire tabletop medium. Paizo may be one of the last horny companies standing. But you don't actually have to look very far on art websites before you find artists 10 times hornier than the old D&D crew from the 80s. Sexualized artwork hasn't really gone anywhere. It's just moved from the purview of corporations to individual illustrators and fan artists. Not to mention that Baldur's Gate 3 was a significant step back towards the sexy fantasy of old. And I remind you, it met with near universal praise. Is the old D&D artwork better than what we've got now? That depends who you ask. Certainly, it's better than 3rd edition art, which in my opinion lacks both style and inspiration. 4th and 5th edition haven't fully returned to pulp, but they did go back to a more painterly style. Priorities have also changed for the art team. Whereas before we'd get these amazing high-effort cover images to the books, and a few decent sketches inside that were a little faster and easier, now everything is medium effort. The book covers have clearly suffered. Yet now, every second page of a D&D book has a full-color illustration. Is that a fair trade? Well, now we're talking opinions, but I don't think so. For me, it's those high-detail, high-effort images where the artist has all the time and all the freedom needed to get it right. People will remember those images years later. They're not going to remember generic rogue hides and shadows on page 16. I also think that D&D sharing an art style with Magic the Gathering is a poor influence on it. Not to say that I dislike Magic art. Magic has some of the best art in the industry, but it's with a purpose. Magic the Gathering artwork is meant to illustrate a concept at a glance. But that same art technique gets applied to D&D. And D&D art isn't supposed to illustrate something at a glance. D&D artwork is supposed to kick your imagination into overdrive. You're supposed to look at these things and get ideas. Nowadays, you just look at D&D art and you go like, oh, okay, that's how that spell looks. But on the other side, I guess I do understand that having strong visualization of spells and magic items can be huge on selling people on the fantasy. I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you like the old art? The new art? Are we in the golden age, or are we living in a dark age? You tell me. It's all subjective, so I'd love to hear everyone's takes. But in any case, it's time to get to Snarf Quest. Larry Elmore is one of the most iconic artists who has ever worked on D&D. In 1983, he created the Snarf Quest comic to go out with Dragon magazine every month until 1989, as a parody of D&D antics. It would return to us several times over the years in various formats and in various publications. Larry would kickstart a book of new Snarf Quest adventures in late 2013 that ultimately released as a graphic novel. Alongside this Kickstarter, a video game was announced by Cell Block Studios. The game was crowdfunded separately, and it quickly earned $37,000 for the goal of bringing Snarf to Steam. The year being what it was, Snarf Quest was intended to be released in a Telltale Games episodic format, with 5 episodes to be released over several months. By 2017, the game had left early access and the first episode was released, and it's been radio silence ever since. The product was... it was rather bad, to say the least, and there also wasn't very much of it, which is why it's an extremely small part of this video. Snarf Quest was originally for young boys in the 80s, and the video game still seems to think it's for that demographic, despite the fact that its core audience is now in their 50s. And worse, the video game isn't particularly adept at appealing to kids either. For one thing, there was basically zero marketing budget to put this in front of young eyes, and even if there was, the game is thoroughly lifeless. The voice acting ranges from, passable...
If anyone can beat a new leader, Why not me, Snarf?
to I clearly don't want to be here.
Unless I get hit in the back of the head and forget what I was doing.
Admittedly, the original Snarf Quest was never laugh-out-loud funny, but it was the kind of funny that just keeps you in a good mood while you read it. You know, it was comic book funny. The pacing and illustration were enough to give the comic enough energy to make that work successfully. Meanwhile, in the video game, everyone just stands in place and fails to land their jokes. I don't think anyone actually wanted to make this game, and it shows. There's nothing redeeming in a gameplay sense either. It's a point-and-click adventure that dares to compare itself to games like Myst. Snarf Quest Tales is not like Myst. It reminds me far more of a bloody, Fisher-Price Castle game I played when I was 6. And when I went back to find footage of that game, I realized I was actually being really mean to that Fisher-Price game. This thing's got some real heart behind it.
Everybody's got a place of their own, a place to relax, a place to call home. My favorite place is a little bit strange. You might even think that I'm slightly deranged. I love my dungeon, yeah, I dig this place. I love my dungeon cause it's such a disgrace.
This channel is one where we deep dive source material and review games related to tabletop franchises. But for the first time after starting one of these projects, I'm really just left here on the lurch with a game that's so bad and so incomplete that there's just nothing to review. But I decided it would still be valuable to make this video anyway, because I think Snarf Quest and Larry Elmore are important pieces of tabletop history, and they're worth a video just on their own, even if the related game spin-off was horrible. Plus, I end up having to look a lot at this old D&D art while I'm editing the lore sections of my videos, and I've been itching for a chance to talk about the old art movement for a while now, and this IP really was the ideal vehicle for us to have that talk. Additionally, Snarf Quest isn't particularly well digitized, so its legacy kind of needs to get preserved through word of mouth and projects like this video. If you like what we do here, please like the video. It's a bit scary to release a video that's not got much of a video game component, since, that's like our entire thing here. But people have been asking for me to cover tabletop stuff that doesn't have video games for a while now, so consider this me dipping my toe in the water. If you want to support this idea and help make this possible to do on some occasions, a like really is the best way to do that, alongside a comment. It gives me the independence to cover all the niche but important topics that don't normally get coverage. Now, let's get into the real Snarf Quest. Let's snarf it up. Let's get snarfed. The original quest begins in Snarf's home, the capital of the Zitva people. The last king is dead, and that means it's time to choose another. Succession in their system is such that any Zitva who wishes can set out on adventures upon the death of the old king. Whoever returns with the most gold or glory at the end of the year will be crowned the new king. Snarf is one such Zitva. He weighs the pros and cons, one tough year of hard work and danger in exchange for a lifetime of pampering and luxury. Ultimately, the math checks out. Snarf's heart is not quite in the right place, but he sets out to win his fortune nonetheless. Snarf is, in the grand tradition of D&D, even back in its earliest of days, he's a murder hobo. His first victim is a friendly orc with a gemstone in its helmet. His assaults fail to have very much of an effect on his new bro. Snarf eventually tries to pry it off of the orc's helmet in his sleep, leading the orc to think he's about to be murdered. Snarf gives chase, before remembering he's not going to win in a fight if he actually manages to catch the orc. He retrieves the helmet after it's been dropped and moves on with his life. Snarf is this particular kind of protagonist. He soon meets with his first traveling companion, Raffendorf, who is a prince transmogrified into a rat. After helping Raff get his foot unstuck, he tells Snarf he knows a place with a ton of treasure and adventure. Snarf bumbles through an encounter with the Dark Knight and takes credit for defeating him. Soon after, the two of them find Ethia, a sorceress. Snarf is immediately smitten and agrees to help her retrieve her magical wand from a cruel wizard. She offers the pair of them a wish each for their service. and Raph is obviously thrilled at the possibility of getting his human body back. Upon finding the evil castle, Raffendorf admits that this is actually the place where he knew that there was treasure. Snarf is doing a bit of a twofer here when it comes to questing, a well-chosen route, it needs saying. Inside, we are introduced to the villain of the week, a biker. Not a biker. A time-traveling wizard named Suthaze. He impresses his long-suffering servant, Giesel, with this new thing he brought back from 1983. It's called a gun. However, Suthaze apparently hadn't read the history books when he was in the future, because Giesel has just found the great tool of revolution, the great equalizer. Giesel misses his shot and scurries off into the castle to avoid retribution. He is found soon after by Snarf. And now, Snarf has a gun. Giesel begs for his life and is allowed to join Snarf in exchange for guidance and help. He leads them straight into a dragon den. Which, is not as bad as it sounds. That is the treasure room after all, that's where they were supposed to go. And this particular dragon in this particular treasure room is a pretty awful guard dog, all things considered. Wrangling a dragon into the dungeon would be a pretty tough task even for the evil wizard Suthaze. The only reason he was able to do it in this case is because this dragon had knocked its head at some point and no longer remembers he's a dragon. His name is Willy, and he thinks he's a duck. Giesel tells them that it's all gonna be okay, so long as no one says the word dragon. With this arrangement, the treasure actually ends up being just kind of free loot. Lots of cash and items that Suthaze brought back from the future. They get every wand they can find, hoping that one of them will be Ithea's, and it's time to make their exit. Perfect timing too, since Suthaze has just caught up with them. Snarf may not be much of a hero, but he is pretty adept at causing trouble. He yells dragon on the way out, and leaves Suthaze to clean up the mess. After getting just a hair lost, Snarf stumbles across a damsel in distress. The Zietva is, for the second time today, head over heels in love. This time, however, that attraction seems to be reciprocated though. Soon the four of them make their escape from the castle, loot in tow. Still though, as they run, the damsel is a bit suspicious. She's tired. She says she's not used to running so much. Girl, how do you have abs like that and zero fitness? This, it turns out, is not a plot hole, because the damsel is Suthaze in disguise. Raffendorf comes clean about how he knew about this place. Suthaze was the one who cursed him. To punish him even further, Suthaze transforms Raph from rat to bug. In an act of desperation, Snarf pulls his gun. He's not entirely sure how to use it though, and his shot goes wide. The ricochet flies into Suthaze's castle, and in a weird set of coincidences, causes the entire thing to explode. Willy the dragon takes another blow to the head, and once more is reduced to being a mere duck. A second shot from the gun goes through Suthaze's foot, and the gang is able to make their escape. They return Ithea's wand, and she agrees to grant their wishes. Raffendorf asks to return to his true form. She turns him back into a rat person. I mean, he was like that when they met. How the hell was she supposed to know that wasn't his true form? She's not psychic. Raph has used up his wish. He's in a state of despair, and Snarf tries to get him to man up. Bud, I wish you could see yourself right now. Okay, that's 2 wishes wasted right here. But, there's a third one now. Giesel helped, so he gets a wish too. Snarf and Raph both want him to make a wish for their benefit. But instead, the little dragon man wishes that the sorceress loved him and would teach him magic. Raph asks to stay with Ithea as well, hoping to trade a year's hard labor for one more wish. Snarf, on the other hand, has more adventures to get to. The sorceress believes that this gun Snarf found is an infernal device of great evil. It must be cast down into the perpetual pit. Snarf is game for this new quest, and he leaves his friends behind. But to aid him on this journey, Ithea gifts him a bag of holding, and plenty of supplies to reach this perpetual pit. Snarf wanders alone towards the pit for a full month before his solitude is interrupted by a UFO crash. Out of the wreckage stumbles a little robot boy. He says he's here to gather info on this strange medieval world. Snarf asks this little guy's name. He says he's a VR. Snarf says, "Hi, Aviar, it's nice to meet you." Aviar agrees to follow Snarf, who, as a future king, is a good person to follow if you want to record the history of a planet. Also tagging along behind them is a dork they meet along the road. they can't really get rid of this guy. I kind of feel like there was probably an odd man out in Larry Elmore's D&D games. That's just a little literary analysis right there for you. This new trio makes it to the big city of Kenovia, where they can finally take a break. Snarf uses some of his fortune to deck them all out in new clothes. Also, it's been a long road, and they're just tired of walking. Feeling like he doesn't want to burn even more of his money, Snarf asks the stable keeper for a wagon piloted by something fast and cheap. And the stable keeper has one such beast, in fact. A strange and rare creature called a Gagglezoomer. Gagglezoomers are large, horse-sized lizard things that spend their whole lives chilled out in a near meditative state, just chillin' in place. But when something touches their back, they freak out and they start running in a straight line until whatever it was gets off of their back. They don't stop for food, they don't tire out or slow down, they will just panic sprint in a straight line. Forever. To go with his new Zoomer, Snarf is given an intelligent gaggle leech that will mount and dismount from the Zoomer with the help of a stick. Snarf proves rather poor at handling his new Gagglezoomer, and some cartoon antics occur wherein they smash up the city and ditch the dork. In time, Snarf gets the hang of piloting his speed demon, though he still doesn't have as good of a grip on stopping. A band of refugees warn them that a nearby city has been conquered by a dragon. The king is likely to offer up his daughter's hand in marriage, plus a lot of money, to any hero that drives off the scaly tyrant. Both of those rewards are basically handcrafted to get Snarf's attention, and he pilots his Zoomer straight at the city. Yet again, failing to stop, the Gagglezoomer crashes through town and strikes the dragon's chief administrator, this rather imposing wizard named Soothaze. After subduing and tying him up, the townfolk direct Snarf to the dragon, who seems rather duck-like. Reuniting with Willy, he laughs with them that Soothaze managed to play this funny prank on the villagers by convincing them that a humble duck was in fact a dragon. Snarf thinks this is a grand scheme. In fact, he's here to help. Snarf thinks it would be hilarious if he pretends to fight the dragon and drive him off into the hills. Willy is nothing if not a cooperative duck, and he flies off in terror. Now that the city is free, the king is thrilled and tries to get his daughter hyped to marry Snarf. Unfortunately, no one thought to actually ask her about it. She's not thrilled at the prospect of marrying a scraggly 4-foot-tall Zietva with the maturity of a 12-year-old boy. Still, she is trying to be a team player here, and she asks to see what the other hero looks like under his helmet before she decides anything. The fact that Aviar is a robot obviously terrifies the poor princess. When she gains consciousness, the little robot stands up for himself. He may not be much to look at, he isn't dressed in finery like the fashion slave princess, but damn it, he's the latest model of robot. He's stylish back home, and he knows it. Upon hearing all this, the princess reprocesses what she just heard. Handsome foreign guy, model, latest fashion. She's utterly enraptured. Snarf is of course a petulant child about this and tries to talk her into marrying him instead, but the king stands up for his daughter's choice. He's not huge on a forced marriage, to his credit. Aviar, for his part, is quite surprised by the fact that the princess likes him, but lets her know he does have some downsides. The biggest one being that he's a robot, he can't ever have children. The king was cool with all of this up until now, but he's got a dynasty to take care of. No kids, no marriage. Snarf is given a ton of monetary rewards to bribe him away from kicking up a fuss. Before they leave town, they notice the distraught princess has started a new fashion trend in the city. They're finally close now to the pit that the sorceress asked them to throw the gun into. Sure would be a shame if Snarf was terrible at stopping his wagon cart. Cartoon shenanigans happen, and the gaggle leech saves the party. Though most of Snarf's treasure is lost to the pit, or eaten by Wazat lizards. Snarf reveals to his companion why they were headed to the perpetual pit. The robot tells him, nah, Ithea's wrong, it's just a gun, you should keep it. Also, don't use it too much, you've only got 3 shots left. As they start to head their way back, an ambushing giant cracks Snarf across the skull. He's not in his right head after this. Like Willy before him, Snarf now thinks he's an entirely different creature. He thinks he's a Gagglezoomer. Aviar tries to tie him down so he won't hurt himself, but that was a poor choice, because now Gaggle Snarf is sprinting directly back towards the giant. The giant removes the rope from Snarf's back and gets into a semantic argument about what kind of creature Snarf is. Snarf is proven wrong by facts and logic, and he's forced to admit that he's not a gaggle-zoomer, and soon decides that he must actually be a bee. His stinger does very little, but he lucks out and defeats the giant anyway. It is then that Snarf's dream girl arrives. The character who started this entire bloody video in the first place. A warrior named Tellery Windyarm. She was here in time to see the victory over the giant, but not here fast enough to see the delusions. She was actually just passing through on the way to the top of a mountain in search of treasure when she saw the heroic deed. Now, Snarf in these situations would typically lay it on a bit too thick and ruin his first impressions. But in this case, his delusions prevent him from being entitled with the fighter's attentions. He's a bee of action now, and Tellery's kinda here for it. Fuck. Oh, fuck. It's B-movie. Oh my god, it's just B-movie. They're ambushed in the dark by a nasty monster, but Snarf easily stings it to death with his sword. Fortunately, the shock of the creature when they light the torches brings the cowardly Zietva back to his senses, and he is Snarf once more. Upon being briefed on his actions, Snarf realizes that he's actually got a chance with this fighter. She's convinced that he's the mightiest hero she's ever met. That's a lot of pressure, and it's also completely wrong. Snarf is a greedy and entitled murder hobo with zero backbone to speak of. It seems inevitable that he'll let her down just by being, himself. But instead, our little greedy anti-hero has just stumbled across a moral code that is about to change him for the better. What would Tellery think Snarf would do? The tunnels lead into a basement, and Tellery suspects that this place is Gathgor's Keep, a legendary place full of monsters and treasure, ruled over by an evil wizard. No, not that one, a new one. The band soon realizes that, while they may all be frauds, Tellery sure as hell isn't. Unfortunately, the group splits in the fighting. Aviar gets pretty beaten up and has to hide with the Gaggle Leech and a Wazat lizard. Meanwhile, Snarf and Tellery stumble across a storage room full of clothes. A plan is hatched to avoid more monster encounters. Tellery will dress as a captive maiden, and Snarf will pretend to have kidnapped her on behalf of Gathgor. The plan works, although it's admittedly a little gross. They stumble across Jarp, a tiny thief who is also intruding here trying to get treasure. Jarp helps them find Gathgor's chamber. Sticking to the plan, Snarf attempts to present the fair maiden he's captured. The plan could have worked, until Gathgor notices, hold on a second, why is this maiden fucking shredded? Tellery radiates protagonist energies in ways that Snarf most certainly does not. She draws her blade that splits the wind. She lied to Snarf earlier. The treasure here belonged to her father. She's here for revenge on the dark wizard who stole it. When Snarf battled Suthays, he needed dumb luck and coincidence in order to stand against him. Tellery, however, is capable of just actually doing combat with such a magic user. Snarf is forced to take cover, but Jarp the thief is reduced to ash. Still, for all her skill, a fighter with an enchanted sword is capable of little more than a stalemate against a powerful sorcerer like this. Hoping to live up to Tellery's expectations, Snarf draws out one of the magic wands he stole from Suthays months ago, and blinds Gathgor, allowing Tellery to land a hit. No longer playing games, this evil wizard freezes her feet to the floor and separates Snarf from his bag of tricks. Aviar arrives just in time to be a distraction, while Snarf helps the fighter remove the frozen boots. Unfortunately, Tellery's attack is in vain, and Gathgor prepares to destroy them with one final spell. Snarf, however, gets to his bag and pulls out another trick. And by trick, I mean he pulls a gun. Inside the vault, they find treasure beyond their wildest imaginations, and they fill a bag of holding up to near bursting with gold. The escape is made, and the party gets back on the road, whereupon another UFO lands. It's a spaceman, here checking up on Aviar. The spaceman takes a moment to try to help the little robot turn off his homing beacon. He's just gotta, snap Aviar's head around like so to shut him down for a second, and... Wait, Wait, he just killed Aviar! At least that's what it looks like to his friends. They knock this murderer out and tie him to the back of a wild gaggle zoomer so that he'll be dragged off to his death as the creature collides with countless obstacles. As the pair mourn Aviar, they turn his head around the right way for a proper burial. And would you look at that, he's not dead. Aviar's curious. What happened to the spaceman? He left. But look at this, now the party has a spaceship, which is very lucky timing because Snarf realizes he's due back in his village tomorrow to be judged as to whether or not he will be king. Snarf and Tellery get dressed up in the finest space clothes and prepare to meet the village, which is strangely empty. You'd think people would come running after they heard a spaceship land on the outskirts. They're too late. The judging is done. The Zeetvas assumed Snarf was dead and are in the middle of crowning Newfort, the strongest Zeetva, king. Snarf is able to delay the coronation and demand a judgment as to which of them did better over the adventuring year. Snarf's spaceship and his multi-million-dollar fortune are obviously impressive, but somehow Newfort's own deeds put the two of them on par, and the elders need some time to decide which of them win. Snarf goes alone to see Newfort's deeds in person, while his friends zip around in a spaceship to collect witnesses of Snarf's mighty deeds. But can they compare to Newfort's? The powerful hero seems to have brought back a tamed dragon. Newfort and his right-hand thug attempt to take Snarf out while he's alone, tying him up in a bag and asking Willy to help them destroy this sack full of snakes. Snarf's friends thankfully untie him in time, and they ask Willy to remain here for now. Snarf tries to tell everyone in town that Newfort brought back a pretty harmless fake dragon that truthfully isn't all there in the head. So Newfort decides to parade Willy around in front of the village to show off. Unfortunately, Willy soon meets a lady dragon down by the stream. She's outraged that the people nearby have clearly cursed the proud creature and heads to the Zeetva village to take revenge and break whatever curse they cast upon him. Newfort, of course, finds himself on stage with entirely the wrong dragon. It attacks, burning Newfort's thug and seizing the wannabe king in her mighty claws. Snarf has really grown as a person this last year. No longer the coward who struggled to steal a gem from an orc. He's made friends, experienced danger, and learned what true heroism is. And much of it is thanks to Tellery. Tellery pleads with him not to go, and comes close to confessing her feelings. But would she still feel that way about him if Snarf ran away? The brave Zeetva, the one true king, approaches the dragon. He's learned so much over this last year. He knows how a hero solves their problems. They solve them with a fucking revolver. The dragon is dead, and Snarf is king. The Snarf Quest has come to an end. Yet, this isn't truly the finale, merely the first arc of the comic. Arc 2 is still part of the original run that came out in Dragon magazine. Unfortunately, it coincided with Larry Elmore leaving TSR to be a freelance artist. He seems to have been much busier doing his freelance work, and the quality of the comic, in my opinion, dropped significantly. Act 1 was actually really tight. There were plenty of characters and plot threads, but Elmore smartly spread them out to all be handled not too many things at once. And when new characters were needed to expand the plotline, he was very good at reintroducing old ones to fill those purposes. Everything feels connected, pleasant, and it's a fun and satisfying read. Act 2 is not like that at all. They get bored of ruling the city and they go off into space to drum up some gold that Aviar knows about so that they can, build hospitals and schools and stuff for the Zeetva. It's much less inspired. Snarf doesn't grow any as a character, stories feel more like speed bumps than actual quests, and I can't tell you how much the comic suffers from taking the entire frigging cast and stuffing them in a confined space for a full story arc. And worse, they then pick up even more sidekicks along the way. The wide cast actually worked quite well in Arc 1, because no more than a few of them were tagged in for the plot at any one time. By the end of Arc 2, the party had started to feel like that episode of Rick and Morty where quirky sidekicks keep appearing from thin air. Still, there's some fun parts, and Snarf Space Quest is still a decent romp. The fact that they start a rock band as a disguise is some pretty true-to-life D&D antics. Beyond those two arcs, it's pretty hard to keep up with Snarf Quest. Like I said before we got into all this thing is not well digitized in any way, and the second-hand physical copies usually run in the hundreds of dollars. Maybe one day Snarf will appear on Kindle or some such, but for now, it remains a pretty tough piece of D&D media to track down. Nevertheless, Snarf Quest and Larry Elmore's contribution to D&D should not be understated. Yes, the video game was horrendous, but that doesn't do much to undercut a legacy this prodigious. Once again, minor apologies that this one was pretty light on the video game angle. And if you like this one, this actually isn't the only D&D comic I've covered. I've got an older video on a rather dark comic called Die that you can check out. Cheers everybody, and I'll see you next time.
I love my dungeon, yeah, I dig this place. I love my dungeon cause it's such a disgrace. No windows for sunshine or clean smelling air. The floor is